Hi everyone, it's Rob Timmings from ECT for Health here, back with another quick two-part video series on reflux medication. So part one is understanding the different cells in the stomach. I think we've got to kind of do a bit of the physiology before we understand the pharmacology. So part one on the stomach cells, that'll be this part. And part two will actually be on the different medications that we use. So let's get started nice and quick. There's really four cells that we need to kind of wrap our heads around. And these are the cells that line the stomach. So if you think about the stomach, it's got an inside lining. That's where all the food's getting digested. It's like a pouch, isn't it? And then there's the outside lining, which comes up against the muscle wall of the stomach. The stomach has it's a muscular bag. But that innermost coating that comes into contact with the food and all the gastric juices, where do the gastric juices all come from? That's this group of cells that we're actually going to have a look at here. So let's pull it up. There's really four cells to wrap our heads around. They are the parietal cell, the G cells, the chief cell, and way down the bottom here, over here they are, the mucus neck cells. Let's start with the G cells. The G cells are a group of cells that line the stomach lining, and the G cells, instead of secreting substances into the gastric lumen to mix with the food and the other gastric juices, what the G cells do is they secrete directly fluids, a chemical, a protein, directly into the blood. And that product is called gastrin. Gastrin. They secrete that directly into the blood. In many respects, they are therefore regarded as endocrine cells. These are actually endocrine cells. We're going to talk about gastrin a little bit later on when we talk about parietal cells. So, G cells secrete their gastrin into the bloodstream, not into the inside of the gut, but into the bloodstream. Whenever they come into contact with protein, with calcium, or when you start to eat anything and your stomach stretches to a certain amount. So as you start to eat and eat and eat and your stomach stretches and stretches, as soon as you get to a certain stretch, these G cells release the substance into the bloodstream called gastrin. We're going to come back to gastrin. The chief cells, these are cells that do secrete their substances into the gastric lumen, and the chief cells are responsible for secreting a protein called pepsinogen. I'll write that one down. Pepsinogen. Pepsinogen. And so right now your chief cells are secreting pepsinogen into your stomach lining. It all becomes part of your stomach juices. And this is a protein. As an ogen, it's a precursor to an enzyme. So any enzyme or any protein in the human body that ends in OGEN is something that needs to be activated. So pepsinogen is secreted by chief cells into the stomach, and it's waiting for something to switch it on. Again, we'll come back to pepsinogen. You know that your stomach secretes acid, and we're going to do that cell last. That's our parietal cell. But because your stomach secretes acid, why is it that it doesn't dissolve itself? Why is it that you can digest almost all meat-based proteins, but you don't digest your own stomach wall? And the excellent reason why you can't digest your own stomach is because of these guys. These guys are called the neck cells, or the mucus cells, neck cells. Everything in medicine seems to have a couple of different names. And what these mucus cells do, as the name implies, is they secrete mucus directly onto the surface of the inside of the stomach. And what that does is that provides protection against the acid that the stomach produces to be able to digest your food. So you're digesting the food and not digesting yourself. So you're making this mucus, you're protecting yourself from your own stomach acid. So now we come to the sort of the key player in your digestive process. As well as being a mechanical bag that mushes up all of the food and makes it into smaller particles so that it can pass through and into the duodenum to be broken down enzymatically, it actually starts the enzymatic destruction of the food that you eat inside the stomach itself. And it's these guys here, the parietal cells, that actually do that. So what the parietal cells do is they have a couple of little pumps in them, and you can see these pumps are called proton pumps. And when activated, these proton pumps switch on and they start pumping out this hydrochloric acid. Now, hydrochloric acid is a very, very strong acid. What it does is it brings down the pH, therefore making the inside of the stomach contents very, very acidic. The pH on the inside of your stomach, when you're secreting hydrochloric acid at a time that you're eating, you start secreting hydrochloric acid. When that pH is measured, it's measured at around about 1 to 2. On a scale of 0 all the way up to 7, acids are measured from 0 up to 7. The strongest of acids are the smallest numbers. A pH of just 1 to 2 is very, very strong acid. And so this hydrochloric acid is incredibly caustic, and you've only got to have vomited and have some of that acid come up into the back of your throat, and you feel how painful that can be, as that acid is in an area that's not protected. Now, this brings us back to these mucus cells that we were talking about down here. Remember, these neck mucus cells, they're producing this mucus that protects the inside of the stomach from the acid that's produced by the parietal cells. But that protective mucus is only in the stomach. It's not down in the small intestine, and it's not up in the esophagus. So should you have any reflux, and should you have any of that stomach acid coming up into the esophagus, of course it's going to start to cause burns, and it's going to be caustic and cause destruction to the mucosa. And that's fundamentally the reason, or the pathophysiology as to why somebody develops gastritis and esophagitis, particularly with gastroesophageal reflux disease. If they have a reduction in mucus production in their stomach, gastritis. If they have a rising of that hydrochloric acid up into their esophagus, then of course they develop an esophagitis. And collectively, gastroesophageal reflux disease, that refluxing of acid, is the cause of that. So, let's come back to this parietal cell. We know that these proton pumps are making the hydrochloric acid. That's the point. How do the proton pumps make the hydrochloric acid? Where are the switches that actually switch this on? Well, there's 3 switches. This substance called gastrin that we talked about earlier is secreted, remember, from these G cells. Gastrin is secreted from the G cells, and when it's secreted from the G cells in response to stretch, in response to eating protein, or eating something with calcium in it, any 3 of those things are going to stimulate the G cells to release gastrin into the bloodstream. That gastrin circulates in the bloodstream, and when it comes into contact with these little receptors here, then it switches on these receptors that instructs the proton pump to start pumping out hydrochloric acid. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism is it can be stimulated by your nervous system, and particularly your parasympathetic nervous system is the one that activates your parietal cells. Your parasympathetic nervous system's main branch to the stomach is called the vagus nerve, and it communicates chemically with your stomach cells using this neurotransmitter, and the neurotransmitter is called acetylcholine. So, anticholinergic drugs would block that. If somebody has a cholinergic response, then of course they're going to have this massive stimulus that's going to cause them to have an increase in secretion of hydrochloric acid, because acetylcholine switches on these little muscarinic receptors, or these parasympathetic acetylcholine receptors. The last of them is a release of hydrochloric acid that occurs when somebody has an allergic response. If you were to have some sort of an allergen come into your stomach, remember your stomach, like your skin, is really a first line of defense for your immune system. So your immune system is going to want to be activated, and certainly want to be interested if you have any kind of an allergen come into your stomach or into your gastric mucosa. Then this will trigger specialized immune cells called mast cells to secrete histamine. And when histamine comes along, particularly, and bonds with these histamine receptors in the stomach, then of course again that switches on hydrochloric acid to destroy whatever it was, this foreign protein that your immune system was trying to eliminate or trying to protect itself against. Now, histamine triggers receptors all around the body, and you've probably heard of H 1 receptors and H2 receptors, histamine 1, histamine 2, histamine 3 receptors, histamine 4 receptors even. In the stomach, these receptors that are switched on by histamine, these are called histamine 2 receptors. And so if somebody has an allergic response that's causing them to have an increase in gastric acid secretion, switching off those histamine receptors by giving them an antihistamine drug that is an H2 receptor blocking drug, then that's how those H2 receptor blockers work. And we're going to go through those in the next video. Alrighty, so I think that pretty much is it in a nutshell. We've looked at the chief cells, we've looked at the G cells, we've looked at the neck or the mucus cells, and the parietal cell. The last one I wanted to touch on is the chief cell and this pepsinogen again. Why we secrete hydrochloric acid is because it switches on pepsinogen. And when it switches on pepsinogen, what happens is it activates and it turns into an enzyme called pepsin. And pepsin is the enzyme in your stomach that breaks down the protein. So here's the thing. If we look at the whole feedback loop here, we've got ourselves a situation where we've eaten some protein. Let's say it was some steak or some fish or some eggs or some tofu, whatever your protein source is. That stimulates my G cells to make gastrin. The gastrin then triggers this receptor on the parietal cell to make hydrochloric acid. The hydrochloric acid then switches on the pepsin, and now I can start to break down the protein that I just ate. That, in a nutshell, are the 4 important cells that sort of kickstarts the digestion and that are all interrelated when we look at hydrochloric acid. Join us for part 2 and we'll actually look at the medications that we use for reflux because they all work on these cells. So this kind of video was a prerequisite for the next one. See you later, guys.